Hi everyone, this is my next video in my name credentials video series, and in this video I will talk about basic authentication using name credentials. Before we get into the Salesforce part and the name credentials part, I first want to cover what actually is basic authentication. Basic authentication is an authentication mechanism in which the server is expecting username and password to be sent in the HTTP request in a particular format. And what is that format? So server is expecting that username and password should be sent in the header, okay? And it should be in this format, username colon password, and this whole string should be base64 encoded. And then this base64 encoded string should be sent in the header of the HTTP request as a value for the key with the name authorization. Okay, so, and I've already explained briefly about headers and body when it comes to HTTP request in my name credential custom authentication video. So if you want to understand what is header, what and body, so you can check out my name credentials custom authentication video. So what server is expecting here in basic authentication is, in the header we have key value pair. So there will be one key with the name as authorization, and in the value we'll have this. Not just this, there will be one more part, but this will be the part of the value, that is username colon password, and the whole thing as base64 encoded. Okay, and how will it actually look like is this. So you see, authorization is the key, right? And then base64 encoded username colon password, and then there is this word basic. Okay, so we have to include this word basic as well. So this is the whole key value pair which server is expecting to be sent in the header of the HTTP request. So how will this integration work? What would happen is, even before the integration is established between client and server will come up with a username and password, and it will share this username and password with the client. So client will also have this username and password, and when the client is making an HTTPS request to server, the client will send the username and password in the header of the HTTPS request in this format, right? And when server receives the HTTPS request, it will then check for this this particular format in the header. It will check whether there is an authorization key or not in the header, and if there is authorization key, then it will fetch out the value which will be in this format, and out of this value it will decode it from base64 encoded to normal username and password string, and if it matches what it originally shared with the client, then it will provide access to its API to the client. And you might ask, why this particular format of header is required in basic authentication? Why not some other format? And the answer to that is HTTP standard or HTTP rulebook. So what is HTTP standard? HTTP standard is the rulebook that defines how data should be requested and responded to over the web. Things like how URL works, how headers are structured, what status code means, and how the authentication works. So this is the rulebook which all the systems over internet have to follow, be it browsers, APIs, or servers. So if they have to follow any authentication mechanism, they have to do it following what HTTP standard says. And for basic authentication, HTTP standard has defined this format, that for basic authentication you have to use this format only and no other format. And the particular standard in this rule book for basic authentication is this RFC 7616. So you can just Google this RFC 7616 if you want to go into more details. Yeah. So this is the standard which defines the basic authentication as per HTTP standard, and the reason why you have to follow this particular format or syntax of the header, right? And one more thing I wanted to highlight here is that this username and password which is being sent in the header is just encoded and it is not encrypted. So there's a difference between being encrypted and being encoded. So for basic authentication, it's just base64 encoded. So if any man in the middle or any hacker gets hold of this information from the header, they can easily decode it and get to know what is the username and password. So this basic authentication in its own is not a secure way of communication between client and server, but it has to be always done over HTTPS. Only then it will be a secure way of communication. If it is done over a plain HTTP, then it's not a secure way. And any man in the middle, if they get hold of this information, which they can, then they can easily decode the username and password, and then the server will get compromised. Now I'll not go into details of this, HTTPS and HTTP. Maybe I might prepare some other video in future in which I'll explain how it makes the communication secure for this sort of authentication. But yeah, I wanted to just highlight that this particular basic authentication in its own is not a secure way of communication unless it is done over HTTPS. And you might also ask that if username and password are not encrypted, then why to even encode it? Why to even base64 encode it? And the reason for that is this. In any integration call, the headers expects ASCII safe characters, right? And if you send the raw username and password in the request, then it might end up in header parsing errors because it might have special characters or spaces or some Unicode characters. And this again is defined by the HTTP rulebook, HTTP standard, that you have to send it in base64 encoded format only to make it ASCII safe, so that header can be easily parsed and processed. That is the reason we base64 encoded, and this is universally followed by all the systems. And we'll see how this base64 encoded username and password looks like when we're actually making the call out from Salesforce to our server. We will log the encoded username and password and we'll see how does it actually look like. Now, before I demonstrate how to implement basic authentication between Salesforce as client and a server, I want to show you how browsers implement basic authentications, or what is the behavior of browser when a basic authentication is implemented. So I'll go to my Edge browser, Microsoft Edge, and I'll try to find a website which has implemented a basic authentication. So we can just write a sample website with basic authentication. We'll go to this first page. Now what it is saying, you need to set a basic authentication header, username authorized, password 001, basic auth protected page. So basically, if you click on this link, it will ask for this username and password. So when I click on this, so let's see what's the username authorized and password 001. Clicked on this, authorized password 001. Right, so it's saying username and password in the basic auth header were the expected value. So what has happened here? So if I go back to this diagram, what I explained was that we implement basic authentication between client and server, right? And what happened here? Here also it was the same thing. So what was client here? Client was our Microsoft Edge browser, and what was server? Server was this. So there must be some code behind this URL, or rather this basic auth protected page. When we click on this, right, so there must be some code behind this URL that is expecting basic authentication, that is not expecting, rather implemented basic authentication. So if you want to access this resource, you have to enter a username and password authorized as the username and password 001, right? So here also it's between client and server only, where client is Microsoft Edge browser and server is some custom code behind this URL. And that custom code has implemented basic authentication as its authentication mechanism, right? Now here we entered username and password, right? And the browser prompted for username and password, and we entered that username and password, and we got access to the API behind this link. But when I was explaining, I was saying that username and password is sent in this format, right? It is sent in this format as a key value pair, where key is authorization and then value is in this format, right? Basic space and then username and password in base64 encoded format. But here nothing like that happened, right? When I clicked, I got a pop-up, I entered username and password. So where is that authorization header we kept talking about? So I'll show you that as well, right? So for that we have to again click on this link, but I think it will not prompt for login again. Yeah. So what has happened here, since we have entered once, right, the username and password, our Microsoft Edge browser has saved that username and password in the cache. And that's why when I tried again clicking this link, it is not asking for username and password. So what we need to do is we have to clear cache. So delete browsing data, and then we'll have to clear browsing history. And then what I'll do, I have cleared the browsing history in my Microsoft Edge. I will close this browser and then I will reopen Edge. Okay, go to Google, then again search for that same website. Yeah, this was the website. Now if I click here again, I should get that prompt, but I want to show you the authorization header as well, right? So for that, what we need to do is we have to click on inspect, right click and inspect, go to network tab, make sure you have this preserve log option is checked, and then we will click on this basic auth protected page, right? We have got the pop-up. Now we'll enter the username and password. Okay, I have entered authorized and password 001. Click on sign in. We have got the access, right? Expected value. So where is the authorization header? So that we can see here. If I go here, right, basic auth results. So what it is saying, headers, right? Headers, response headers, but we need to look into the request header. This is request headers. If I scroll down, see this entry, authorization, basic space and some string. And if I go back to my diagram, what it says, authorization colon basic space some base64 encoded string, and that's what you're seeing here, right? So when I entered username and password in the browser send this in this format, authorization header and basic space and this base64 encoded string. But there's a question here, how did browser know that it has to include this authorization header? Yes, we know that the code behind this link, right? If I go back, the code behind this link has implemented basic authentication as the authentication protocol. But how is browser knowing that? You know how? Because browser is client, right? So how is browser, when I click on this link, how browser understands that it has to, this is a basic authentication mechanism, or rather protocol, which the code behind this link has implemented, and browser has to show a pop-up here. How does browser know that? So we will go into all those details. I will show you how all these things works, how browser get to know that the backend system is expecting basic authentication mechanism, has implemented basic authentication protocol, and how does browser knows that, and based on that, why browser shows username and password pop-up, right? And when we enter username and password pop-up, how does browser send this authorization header? So we'll see all the things, okay? And one more thing, when I was going through this diagram, right, I said that this is not encrypted, it is just encoded. So if anyone gets hold of this value, they can just decode it. Let's see if we are able to decode it or not. So ideally what this is base64 encoded. And what it is base64 encoding? It is encoding username colon password, right? That's what I told here, username colon password in base64 encoded format. So what is username? Username is authorized and password is password 001. So ideally, if we decode this, what we should get? We should get authorized colon password 001, right? Because that is this part, base64 encoded of authorized colon password 001. So let's copy this, and there are tools available online which can decode your base64 encoded string. So just go to Google again and we'll write base64 decode. Okay, base64 decode. Go here, any link is fine. I will paste my string and I will click decode. See, it's the same thing, authorized colon password 001, right? Authorized colon password 001. So what has browser done is it has taken the username colon password and base64 encoded it, and that's what it is sending here, right? This one, right? Hope that makes sense. Now what we are going to do next is we will create our own custom API, just like this one. If I go back, right, just like this one, when I clicked here, there must be some custom code getting invoked behind this, right? So just like this, we will create our own custom API, which will implement basic authentication as authentication protocol. And first, we will invoke that custom API from our web browser and see what is the behavior. And then we will invoke that custom API from Salesforce using name credentials. And in order to do that, what all tools we'll use? So first is, we will write our custom API code in JavaScript, something like this. Okay. And then we will run this JavaScript code using Node.js. And using a tool called ngrok, we will expose this JavaScript code, which is being run using Node.js in my local. We will expose this JavaScript code onto a public URL. What that means, we'll expose this onto internet so that Salesforce can make an API call to this custom API. Because if this code is just running in my local, because if I use Node.js to run this code, it will just run in my local. It will not be available on the public internet as a public URL. And in order to expose this code onto public internet, we will use a tool called ngrok. Okay. And I will not go into details of what is ngrok, what is Node.js and all those stuffs, because I have already created a separate video explaining in very detail how you can use ngrok and Node.js to create a custom API and then expose it onto public internet to be available for other systems to invoke that. What I'll do, I'll leave a link of that video in the description of this video if you're watching this on my YouTube channel. And if you are watching this on my website, then I will leave a link to that video in the blog post where this video will be embedded. Right? Now let's first initialize Node.js. So if you see, this basic auth.js code is stored in this location. Documents, blog, learning, basic auth. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to initialize this folder with Node.js. And how do you do that? Just open a command prompt instance. Okay, you need to navigate to that path. For that, I will just do cd documents. Or let's copy this rather. Okay, copied the path. Yeah, right now we are in this path. So in this, we have to run this command. So this folder is now initialized with Node.js project. If you can see, just refresh this. You can see package.json has appeared here. Okay. And we also need to install a dependency which we will use in our JavaScript code. And that dependency is this express. Okay. So let's install that as well. npm install express. Right. So if I go back to that folder, now you can see a few more folders and files getting created. Now, as I said, I don't want to go into details of these commands npm init and what is npm install express, because I have already explained that in another video. I would recommend you just go and have a look at that video to understand what these things are. Okay. So let's go back to our JavaScript code. So what is Express? Express is a sort of library which gives us some inbuilt, functionalities or methods which we can use to handle HTTP request. So that's what Express is, right? And what this line is doing is it is loading that Express library into our JavaScript file. Okay. And this line is creating an instance of that Express library. So app is an instance of that Express library. And using this instance, we will use all the methods provided by this Express library. Okay. Now coming to this line, what this line is doing is when you write this line app.use express.json, this will enable the instance to be able to parse the HTTP request and set the responses. So if I scroll down, this is where we'll capture the HTTP request in this variable request and response, REQ and RES. So this line will enable this instance to be able to parse the request and set the response. Okay.
And now this whole part, right, which I'm highlighting, sorry, till here, is essentially the logic of how we will implement basic authentication protocol. Okay, so this is the whole logic. I will come to this one by one, but before that I wanted to explain this line. What is this? So this essentially, what is this doing is, so see, this is the same app instance variable, right? So what it is doing, if any system like Salesforce or even our Microsoft Edge browser tries to hit the endpoint, okay, then the control will land here. This is the piece of code which will capture that request, or this is the piece of code where that control will land. Okay, so the URL will not look like this. So there will be a base URL and then slash this secured endpoint. Okay, so we'll create that base URL in a bit. So with that base URL and then slash secured endpoint, if any system or even the browser invokes this whole endpoint, then the control will land here. Okay, but the control will not immediately go to this step, because if you see, there is something called basic auth. So this is the method which will first execute. And what is this method? This method is actually what will enforce the basic authentication protocol. So if I go back, if I scroll up, this method is nothing but this method. Okay, so this is the whole method which is implementing basic authentication protocol. Okay, so we will see this in real time when we hit this URL. I will explain at that time what all these things mean and what is happening. Okay, first what we'll do, we'll start the Node.js server for this JavaScript code, and we will, using ngrok, we will expose this custom code onto a public URL. Okay, let's go to our command prompt. I'm in the same folder where the JavaScript code is. So I'll write node basic and I'll run this. You will see server running on HTTP localhost :3000. What is this? If I go back to my code, it is this line which is getting logged. So what has happened here is, when I started the Node.js server for this JavaScript code, now the Node.js server is running on this port, and what made it do so was this app.listen and 3000. This is the port number. So what is happening is, what has happened is, now this whole code, you can say, is running on this localhost port 3000 and waiting for someone to hit this. When I say someone, it could be anyone, any system like Salesforce or even browser. Okay, so it's just waiting on that port to be invoked, right? So if I invoke this, for example, if I copy this, right? So this is the base URL which I was talking about. I have copied this, and the full URL will be the base URL slash this secured endpoint. So if I open Microsoft Edge, I open a new window. If I paste this and then secure slash endpoint, what will happen? Let's see. See, it is asking for username and password. This is what we understood, right, some time back when we saw this example. If I go back to this page, when we were seeing this example, when we clicked here basic auth protected page, it prompted at the browser prompted that window. And when I click this also, when I in this window, if you can see, when I pasted this link, it's the same behavior. So somehow this JavaScript code has enforced basic authentication protocol, right? And we'll see how it's working in the backend. We'll see everything. If I go back to this URL, this is a local host URL. This is not on public internet. Even though in my browser, when I pasted this URL and entered, it is able to invoke the code because my browser understands this localhost URL, just like any browser in any system will understand their localhost URL. But can I share this URL with external systems like Salesforce? No, we cannot share this URL because they will not be able to access this local host URL because it is local to my system or my laptop. Only the browser running in my laptop can access it. So how do we expose this URL on public internet so that external systems can access this? And for that, we will use a tool called ngrok. Okay, and how do you do that? Open one more command prompt. So ngrok is already installed in my system. It is all configured. And as I said, you can refer to my other video to understand what is ngrok and how it works. Okay, so I'll go to my ngrok folder. What I'll write here is ngrok http 3000. What this command means is it is saying that anything which is running on this port in my local, for that create a public URL, so that if any system hits that public URL, it will be redirected to this localhost code. Okay, so when I click enter here, see, it has given me this URL, and it is saying as well, it is forwarding this URL to my localhost. If I maximize this window, what it is saying, forwarding this URL to my localhost URL. So what if I copy this URL? I've copied this, go back to my Edge browser, open a new tab, paste this URL, and then again slash secured hyphen endpoint. What should happen? Let's click this. So you'll get this warning when you use ngrok. Just ignore this. Click visit site. See, it's the same thing. It's asking for username and password just like it asked here. So it's the same behavior. So here we are using directly the localhost endpoint, but here we have now exposed this localhost onto a public URL using ngrok, and we got a public URL, and here we are invoking that code via public URL endpoint. And this for sure we can share with external systems like Salesforce, because they can access this URL because it is on public internet, right? Now let's dive deeper. And what I'll do now, moving forward, I will always open this URL in incognito mode. Why? Because if I don't do that, then once I have entered the username and password, right, from next time the browser will not ask for this prompt because it will save that in the cache. So what I'll do, I will open incognito mode. This is in incognito, right? And I'll just enter it here. Visit site. So yes, we are getting this username and password prompt in incognito now. Okay, so what I'll do, every time I have to rerun this, I will close the incognito mode and then reopen it again. Okay, now let's go back to our original diagram of basic authentication. In this, what I said was that in basic authentication, client sends authorization header in this format to the server. Now if I go back to my browser, here Microsoft Edge is the client and server is what? Server is our custom API, right? Or you can say this backend code. So what do you think, at what point the client, which is Microsoft Edge, at what point Microsoft Edge is sending this authorization header? At what point it is sending this authorization header? Is it when I hit this link in the browser, or is it when I will enter the username and password? At what point it will send the authorization header? So if you see, there are two actions here. One is you paste this link in the URL and press enter. That is the first action. And next action is that the browser gives me this pop-up and I enter username and password. So that is the next action. So there are two actions. And in which action do you think the authorization header is being sent? Let's check that. What I'll do, let me go back to my incognito. This is incognito. Let me close this once. Open again incognito, paste. So before I hit enter, I have not yet hit enter, I will do inspect, go to network. Remember the way we checked the request header initially. So we'll do the same here. Go to network, preserve log, and we'll monitor this. So I have not yet hit enter. Now I will hit enter. Okay, so I'll hit enter. So I'll click visit site. Okay, let's see. So this is the first log which we can check. So, and this if you see is the same name, secured hyphen endpoint, which we have given in our JavaScript code, right? If I go back, let's analyze the header here, request header. We are more interested in request header, right? So this is the request header. See, let's see if there is any authorization header or not. I'm scrolling down, and there is no authorization header, right? There is no authorization header. So in the first action, the authorization header is not sent. Now if I enter the username and password, so what is the username and password which is there in my code? This is the username and password, Salesforce user my secret 123. Let me enter that now. Salesforce user my secret 123. So just look at this section. You will see one more entry appearing here as soon as I click sign in. Okay, let me click sign in. You saw one more secure endpoint entry entered here. Click on this. Let's go to request header again. Let's see. See, this time we have got authorization header. Earlier in the first action, this header was not present. That means in the first action, browser did not know that it is basic authentication. That's why it did not send authorization header, right? But in the second action, as soon as we entered the username and password, browser knew that it is basic authentication that the backend code is expecting. That's why it sent the authorization header, right? Now let's analyze our JavaScript code, that how that code is letting the browser know that it is basic authentication, and the result of which the browser is prompting for username and password. Let's go back to our JavaScript code. If you remember, we understood till this point, right? And after that, I said that I will explain these things later. And I explained this one, right? These two things. So what is happening? As soon as we entered this right in the URL, the control landed here at this point. Why? Because this is how this express works. This express library works. So right now, if you see app.get, so this get indicates that we are using get method in this integration, okay, or in this HTTP call. So we have methods, right? Get, post, put, all those things. So this is for get. So as soon as the URL is hit in the browser, the control lands here. And what does the JavaScript does is that before sending any response like this, it will first execute this basic auth method. So this is also a custom method only, right? So if I go back, this is a method. Now what we are doing here, we are logging the we are logging the headers. So this header is what? This is sent from the browser. So think about it like this. Think about the first action. So I told, right, there are two actions. First is when we enter the URL in the browser and hit enter, that is the first action. So right now I'm explaining that action. As soon as you enter the URL in the browser and hit enter, the control lands here. Then this part gets executed. The control goes to this method. And here, then the JavaScript code starts executing. Now what is happening here is we are logging the request header. I will show you where the headers are getting logged, right? Or rather, let me show you. So it will appear here only. So this, if you remember, this was a terminal I used to start the Node.js server, right? Let me clear this rather, okay, because there are too many things here. Let me clear this screen, okay, and let me start the Node.js server again. Okay, so this is now, sort of empty. Now what I'll do, so all these logs, right, all this console.logs will appear here in this command prompt only. Okay, so what I'll do, I'll close this incognito. Let me copy this URL, open incognito again. I have not yet pasted, sorry, I have not yet pressed enter. So if I go to my command prompt, right now we don't have any logs because the code is not yet executed, right? The control has not yet landed here because I have not pressed enter in my incognito window. As soon as I'll press enter, that is the first action, the code will land here, right, in this line. From there, it will go to this basic auth method here, and then it will try to log the headers, and that we will see in this console. So let's see if it is happening or not. And after that also there are a few other things which will happen. So it will first log the header. Then in the header, it will try to find out if there is any key with this name authorization. If it is there, then it will log that as well. Okay. And if it is not there, it's doing something. Okay. It has returned something to the browser. We will come to this. So first let's hit enter in our browser and see the console logs. Enter. So right now it has not yet invoked because, as I said, right, this we have to first pass this warning message. So I'll click visit site. Okay, now go back to our command prompt. See, so if I go back to JavaScript code, first is it is logging request.header, right? So this is what you are seeing as header. This whole thing is header till this point. In this is same, this is the header which browser is sending. We already saw that in the inspect window in browser. So now we are seeing that again in our Node.js console. And this also, if you see, there is no header with key as authorization. And this we already checked in the browser console using inspect. We are confirming that again here. There is no key value authorization. And if I go back to my code, the code tries to fetch if there is any header with this key authorization. But it is not there, right? We have checked. So when we are logging this, so it fetches, it checks if there is any header with this key and stores in this auth header variable and tries to log that. But we have already seen it's not there. So when we log it, it will show undefined. Let's go back. Auth header is undefined, right? So this we have already seen. So this is right now the first action has happened. That is, we have entered the URL in the browser and we have pressed enter. Okay. Now, if I go back to my incognito, the browser has shown this pop-up because browser somehow understood as part of the first action that this is basic authentication. Okay. Now, what in the code made the browser understand that it is basic authentication? It is this path. So what this code is saying is, if authorization header is not present, right? If there is no authorization header, so this authorization header, if it was present, it would have been stored in this auth header variable, and we are making a check. If this auth header is not present, right? Not of auth header, then we are setting this response, right? In the response header, we are saying this key value pair www-authenticate and then this basic realm is equal to something, right? We are sending this back to the browser if auth header is not present as part of the action. So we know as part of the first action, there was no auth header because browser itself did not know that it has to send the authorization header. So it did not send. So what JavaScript did was, if there is no authorization header, it sent a response to the browser and set this key value pair in the header with this. Okay. Now this is important. This is important. This key value pair in the header is what lets the browser know that this is basic authentication being followed by the code, by the backend code. So this is a standard key value pair. Okay, this part can be anything, access to secure endpoint, but rest is standard. Like this is a standard key www-authenticate and then basic and then realm is equal to something you can write, anything you can write here. So if any browser, not just Edge, right? Any browser, you use Chrome, you use Mozilla or Safari, they know that if as part of that action, whatever the user has performed, if part of that action, the backend code is sending this header, then they know this is a standard, right? Then they know if they get this header in the response, www-authenticate, all the browsers know that this is the backend code is expecting basic authentication here. So that is the language of browsers. They know that if they get this in part of the response, this is a basic authentication flow, and that is the reason they prompt for username and password. So when they understood that this is basic authentication flow, they prompted for username and password. They as in Microsoft Edge in this case, right? As soon as JavaScript, found out that there is no authorization header, it's sent back this response in the header. And when as part of the response of the first action, Edge got this response in the header, Edge understood, right, that this is basic authentication. Now its job is to show username and password prompt so that user can enter username and password, and then browser can send that username and password as an authorization header. And if you see in this JavaScript code, we are returning this status as well. So if auth header is not present, we are setting this in the header, which is letting the browser know that it is basic authentication, and we are returning the response with the status code, right? So we can check this as well. How do we check that? Let's go back to our incognito. Let's close this. Let us open again incognito. Let me copy this URL. Control-Shift-N, V. Before I press enter, I will open inspect. Go to network tab. I'll wait for the logs here. So as soon as I perform the first action, I hit enter. Okay. So yeah, I click on visit site. Now the first action has been done. If I go here, secure endpoint, you see status is 401. If I click status 401 unauthorized, right? That's what it is setting, status 401. So we are sending 401 if there is no authorization header as part of first action. And that's what we are seeing here, status is 401, right? And if you see, status code as 401 and response header, this one, right? We have sent this as well, www-authenticate here. So we sent it from here only, right? This is what we set here. And if I go back, so what happened was, when we performed the first action, browser got this in response and it understood, okay, this is basic authentication flow, so it has to show the username and password prompt, right? And also, if I go back to my JavaScript code, you will see that once the JavaScript code has returned this response, the code is finished. It will not execute it any further because the control has already been returned to the browser, right? So this code is finished. Now what would happen if I go back to my Edge? Here now the browser is waiting for the username and password to be entered. So this is the second action. What will happen when we'll enter the username and password here? Again, this code will get invoked. And again, the control will land here. Okay. And again, before reaching this point, the control will first go to this method, basic auth. But this time, as I said, right, this time while performing the second action, browser knows that this is a basic authentication protocol being followed by the custom API in the backend. So what it will do, once we enter the username and password, it will generate the header, this header. Because browser now knows the authentication protocol is basic authentication, it knows this as part of the response of the first action. So this time when we do the second action, it will generate this header. Now these things are again language of browsers. They know what to do. All the browsers have this inbuilt, you can say, knowledge inside them, right? It's coded in them that if they received, as part of first action, they received this response, then they have to show the pop-up, and once they have to show the pop-up for username and password, and once the user enters the username and password, in the next request which they will send to the backend code, they will generate the authorization header. Okay. So what would happen if I go back here? Next time, when I will enter username and password, the control will land here. It will execute this basic auth method, that is this. It will log the header. It will now check for authorization header, and this time it will find the authorization header. We'll log that header as well, and this time this condition will not satisfy because auth header is not null, because authorization header is present. So this variable will not be null, so this will not get satisfied. So this whole part will be skipped, and then we'll again console log the auth header. Okay, I think I have logged it twice, here also and here also, but that's fine. And then what it will do, it will split the auth header. You know, it will split it using the space. Okay, and what actually will be the auth header? So if I go back to my diagram, so this is the authorization header, right? So it is trying, this statement is trying to fetch the value of this key. Okay, so this is the key. So this is the value, right? Basic and then base64 encoded username colon password. So this statement, this auth header will have what? Basic space base64 encoded username and password. Okay, and that will split using space. Sorry, so the space is here, right? Basic space. So it will split using this space and it will get this part only, right? It will split, it will get an array, and the first entry on that array will be basic, and second entry will be the base64 encoded username colon password. So it will pull out the second entry. One index means what? In array it's the second entry, right? So it will pull out the base64 encoded credentials. So still till this point it will be base64 encoded only, right? And from there it will decode it. Okay, this statement will decode that base64 encoded username and password. Okay, base64 encoded username colon password, this. So this statement will decode it, and then again it will split using colon and get the username in this variable and password in this variable, and then it will compare if it matches what it is expecting. So what it is expecting? This variable, right? And this variable is what? Salesforce user, and this variable password is what? My secret 123. Okay, and if it matches, then there is a statement called next. Next means now, so this method, right, basic auth, what was executed from here. So as soon as we write next in this basic auth method, which is here, the control will again land here. it will come back here and it will execute this. It will send back this response to the browser. Okay, and if the username password does not match, then we go into else, right? We go into else and it will send back, it will again send back this header, okay, and this status code 401 with this value, invalid credentials. Okay, now I have modified my code a bit. I have removed that duplicate auth header logging which I was doing. I have removed that and I've added few more console log statements. For example, here I'm logging the base64 credentials and after that I'm also logging this one after decoding, and then after splitting what is the username and password, all those things. Okay, so let's go back to our Edge browser and let's enter the username and password and let's see what happens. So all your logs, all your console logs will appear here. Okay, so right now it's waiting for a new invocation, this Node.js console. So let me go to my Edge, and what is the credential which we need to enter? Salesforce user my secret 123. Okay, let's see what happens. Salesforce user my secret 123. We will also check the request from here and we'll also check what is being captured here. It should be same, but we'll verify that. Let's click sign in. Yeah, you are authenticated. Welcome to the secured endpoint. If I go here, this time request header, we have got this authorization header. If I go to my console, let's see what's happening there. We have got, this is the console for the latest request, right? Let's see what's happening here. Let's go back to the code again. So when I entered the username and password, the control would have landed here. Okay, it would have gone in this basic auth method. Then it has logged request.header, all the header, right? And that's what we are seeing here. This is all of the header. It has logged it, and then it is looking for authorization key. So we have seen in the inspect window in Edge browser, it is present. So here also we can verify that. See, it is present here, this, right? So it will find that value, it will save it here, and then we are logging that as well as auth header colon. So if I go back, auth header colon, right? Same thing. This authorization header, basic space, and this base 64 encoded username colon password. And then since this will be populated, so this code will be skipped. And then what it is doing, it is splitting using space, right? And getting the value in the second index of the array, right? So what it should fetch. If I go back and we are logging this, and I'm again logging this base64 credentials here, right? In this variable here, not variable, this string, after this string. Okay, so if I go back, see base64 credentials. So I have pulled out this part, only this part, that is, this was split using space, this space here, and then I have pulled out this part, okay, in this variable, and then in this variable we'll decode it and save it, decode the value of this variable and save it in this variables, and I've again logged this as well, credentials, see here. So if I go back to my console and credentials, if you see, this is what, this is decoded, right? Decoded username colon password, right? So this has got the decoded username colon password, and then in this variable username and password, we are saving both username and password using this statement. Okay, the username and password also, this also I have logged. See, username Salesforce user, password my secret, and then the code, what would have happened, because this would get satisfied, right? This will get satisfied, it will execute next. So next means the control will land here and this will be returned in the response. So we can check this. This is what we saw. You are authenticated. Welcome to the secure endpoint. If I go to the browser, not this one, this one, see, you are authenticated. Welcome to the secure endpoint. And I believe it should be somewhere here as well. If it gives response body, then with headers, this is all header. What is there in this? See, in the response, you are authenticated. Welcome to the secure endpoint. That is what we are showing here, right? Right. So this is the scenario wherein we entered the correct username and password, and that was sent by the Edge browser as an authorization header, and our code decoded that, matched with the correct username and password, and since it matched, it sent back this response, and that's what it was shown in the UI. Now let's look at the flow when we enter wrong username or password. Okay, so if I go back to my code, so if the credentials will not match, if I enter incorrect username or password, it will go in this block else, right? And in that it will again set this header, the same header which tells the browser that this is basic authentication protocol being followed here, and the browser then shows the pop-up window to capture the username and password. So what will happen if I enter wrong username and password? Then what would happen is the browser will again show the pop-up to enter the username and password again, right? So let's do that. Let's try that as well. So now what I'll do, I will close this incognito again. Yeah, this one I'll close and I'll reopen. Right, I will also open the inspect window here. Okay, network, yeah, hit enter here, visit site. Now let's enter something, something else. What is the credential? It is Salesforce user mysecret123, and I will enter just something random. I will enter Aniket and Aniket123. Anything you can enter, right? So what is the expectation here? The code will go in this block, in this else block, and on seeing this header again, the browser will show the pop-up again for username and password. That is the expectation, right? Let's see if that is happening or not. Wrong credentials, sign in. See, again we got the pop-up. And if I go back here, I think in this one, this is 401 unauthorized. What are we sending here? Yeah, we are sending 401 unauthorized only, right? So yes, in the second one also we got 401, and this one, right? Yes, so in the second one, if you see, browser did send the authorization header, right? But this is not the correct one, right? So if I, so this secure endpoint is the details when I entered the wrong username and password, right? So this is what it sent in authorization header, and our code must have decoded all these things. So we can see the username and password in the console, right? So if I go to my Node.js console, yeah, this is the latest one, right? See, it decoded wrong. I mean, it did not decode wrong, but it decoded this, whatever I entered, Aniket123, right? So if I go back to my edge, so it sent the authorization header, but this time the problem was that the credentials were wrong. So again, we got this response only, 401, right? Which we sent here, 401. And as well as the code set this header. So what did browser do? It got that. So this was the request, right? This was the request. And if I go back to the response, minimize this, response headers, see, again it got this. This we sent this time from this part of the code. Okay, so as soon as the browser got this, it again showed the pop-up. So every time you, unless and until you enter the correct credentials, it will keep showing the pop-up, because every time this code will execute, right? So this is the scenario wherein incorrect credentials are entered. Okay, now that we have seen that how browser behaves when the backend API is expecting basic authentication protocol, now let's see how to implement this basic authentication flow between Salesforce and this Node.js API. This same code we'll use as a server. However, as client, this time we'll not use Microsoft Edge browser, but we will use Salesforce, right? So if I go back to my original diagram, this one, till this point, this client was our Microsoft Edge browser, right? And this server was a JavaScript code exposed via Node.js and ngrok. But now this will be what? Salesforce. Okay, and this would remain same. It will be Node.js. Now, unlike the browser implementation or the browser behavior which we saw, which involved user interaction, right? Like this, where I was entering username and password, and then all the stuffs were happening in the back end. When we integrate between systems like Salesforce and Node.js, there is no human interaction or user interaction happening. This integration is a system-to-system integration, and this is happening in the backend. There is no user interaction happening here, the way it was happening in the browser example. And in the browser or the Microsoft Edge example, I told you, right, there were two actions involved. When we hit this URL for the first time, the browser did not know that the backend code is expecting basic authentication, that the backend code is following basic authentication protocol. So in the first action, it did not know that. Only when the backend code returned this response, only then the browser understood that it is basic authentication, and then it prompted for username and password window, right? But in this integration, where it is system to system integration, wherein client is Salesforce, client system is Salesforce, and server system is Node.js, even before the integration happens, both Salesforce and Node.js would have already agreed on that this integration will follow basic authentication protocol. It's not that when Salesforce tries to invoke Node.js, Salesforce is not aware that this server will follow basic authentication. So even before the integration has happened, both the parties would have already agreed that this integration will follow basic authentication protocol. So Salesforce already knows that in order to make a call out to this system, it has to follow basic authentication. So what will Salesforce do? In the first call, there will be only one action. There will not be two actions here, the way we saw in the browser's Microsoft Edge example. There will be only one action here. It will be a single action, and in that action only, Salesforce will send the authorization header in the first go. As soon as Salesforce is making the API call, it will send the authorization header. Why? Because Salesforce already knows that the server is expecting basic authentication mechanism. Because even before the integration is happened, or even before the integration is established, both the system has already agreed on that pattern, right? However, in the browser example, this was not the case. When I hit this URL, I was not aware. Even though I was aware, but in a sense, the browser was not aware that the backend system is expecting basic authentication. That's why there were two actions. But here, in real world implementation or in the real world projects, both the system would have already agreed even before the integration is established, right? So there will be only one API call, and in that API call only, Salesforce will set the authorization header, right? Let's go ahead and implement this. So for that, I will open my free developer org. I will go to setup. I will go to name credentials. Now you see entries here like name credential, external credentials. Now what are these, how they are linked, like what is external credential, what is name credentials? This I have already explained in my previous video wherein I explained custom authentication using name credentials. In that video, I have explained in details why they are two separate entities like external credentials, name credentials, how they are linked, what is their purpose and all. So if you want to understand those things in detail, you can refer to my name credentials custom authentication video. I will leave a link to that video as well. All right. So in order to set up name credentials, what we do is first we create external credentials. So click on new. We can give any name. Let's give it basic auth EC. EC stands for external credentials. Copy this, is the same. And authentication protocol, what we have to use? We have to use basic, right? We have got an option for basic authentication. Select that, click on save. So external credentials is used to hold the authentication protocol. Okay, so we have created external credentials with this authentication protocol. And what is the use of name credentials? Name credentials is used to hold the endpoint. So we'll create that as well in a minute. Okay. So once we have created external credentials, we need to create principals. Right now, again, what is principal? If you want to understand this in more detail, you can refer to my video name credentials custom authentication video, right? So I will write here basic auth P for principal. Identity type, for now I'll use name principals. Okay, username and password. Now what is this username and password? So this is the username and password which JavaScript is expecting here, Salesforce user and my secret 123. So copy this Salesforce user, and password I'll just write it here, my secret 123, my secret 123. And why did, when I'm creating principal, why I got this option, username and password? I got this option because, let me save it first. I got this option because I used authentication protocol as basic authentication. So as soon as you put authentication protocol as basic authentication, Salesforce understood that this is basic authentication. Now we have to save somewhere the username and password which the server is expecting. That's why when you create principal here, it gave you this option. Okay. So, okay, let me delete this once. If I had not selected basic authentication and then if I had created the principal, what would have happened? Suppose let's select custom here. Okay, save it. Now if I create a principal, see the options are a bit different. This identity type is grayed out, and there is no option for entering username and password. There's something called authentication protocol, authentication parameters, right? So based on this authentication protocol, what Salesforce is doing, it is just giving you corresponding options, right? So when I selected custom, it did not give me option for username and password, but when I select again basic authentication, click on save, when I create principal, basic auth p, select name principal, see we got an option for username and password. So let me enter Salesforce user, and password is my secret 123, my secret 123, right? And then we have to give access to this principal for my current user. So how do you give that? You either give it via permission set or via profile. I will give it via permission set. So I'll open my user setting. Yeah, I've opened a new tab. Go to advanced user detail. Select any permission set. I have got a lot of permission sets added to my current user. I will select this call out permission set for admin user, and using this I'll give access to that principal. External credential, principal access. Edit. See basic auth EC, basic auth P, select it, save. Now if I go back to my external credential in this tab, if I click again edit, okay, I need to refresh this page. Let me refresh this once. Click on edit again. Yeah, so this is now added. So this principal, my user has got access to this principal via this permission set now. Yeah. Okay, now what are principal? Why do we need principals? How these mappings and all work? Again, I have explained in a lot of detail all these things in my name credentials custom authentication video. You can refer to that video and you will get a very good understanding of all these things, principles, and how this mapping and all are done, and other use cases as well. So I would recommend you just watch that video once. Now we have created we have created name credential, we have created principal, given access to my user to this principal. Now we will create name credentials, right? So this is external credential. Basic auth EC is external credentials. Now we'll create name credential corresponding to this. So click on name credentials again. Now click name credentials, new. Here we'll give basic auth NC. NC stands for name credentials. URL. Which URL you have to give? You have to give the URL of the endpoint. So this is the same URL, right? We'll use this URL only. This is the endpoint we are invoking. Copy this. You have to give only the base URL in name credential. Okay. And select our external credential which we created, basic auth EC. And rest of the settings, just keep it as is. Click save. Now we have got the name credentials also created. Now we'll make the call out. So for that, we will open developer console. Okay, and we will make a call out from, let me close all this. We'll make a call out from here. Let me remove this. I have already got the code ready. This is the code which we'll use. I will share this code as well. Okay. So if you look at this code, what it is doing, we are making a call out to you. We are using this name credentials, and this name credentials base URL is what? This, right? This, and then we are calling slash secured endpoint, and this is what? Secured endpoint is our nothing but this, right? Secured endpoint. So essentially, we are calling this endpoint only, right? The base URL slash secured endpoint, but we are calling it now from Salesforce using this syntax, right? And we are doing a get, and then we are sending the request, and then we are logging the status code which we'll get from Node.js as well as the body of the response, and we will also log header keys. So I'll tell you why we are logging this. Okay, and yeah, so I think we are ready to make the call out from Salesforce, and our Node.js server is also running here. I have cleared the console and Node.js server is running. So once we make a call out from Salesforce, we should also see all the details sent from Salesforce here. Why? Because this code only will get invoked, right? And we have these logging statements here. So these all will get executed again, right? So let's make the call out. Let's go back to this code. Okay, and click on execute. Debug. Yes, you are authenticated. Welcome to the secured endpoint. Status code 200. So what we were doing, we were logging the status code. So we have got status code as 200 right here, and body, you are authenticated. Welcome to the secured endpoint. So what has happened? As soon as we hit this endpoint, the control landed here, right here, and then the same thing which happened when we invoke this via browser. The control landed here, it went to basic auth method, but here if you see, it gave this response only in the first go. That means what would have happened? This part would not have got executed. And why? Because that means auth header was already present in the API callout. So we will check all these things. So the control would have landed here, then console.log we have done, right? So let's see what all headers we got from Salesforce. So let's go to this, right? So these are the headers we got from Salesforce. And if you see, authorization is already there. That's what I said, right? When you are doing system to system integration, like in this scenario between Salesforce and Node.js, in the first go only the client or Salesforce in this case will send the authorization header. That's why we got the authorization header in the first go, in the first call itself, right? And if you see then our next, so auth header has fetched the authorization header, right? And we are logging that auth header in this auth header colon. So if I go back to my right auth header, we are logging this, right? And then again, base 64 credentials is what we are pulling out this part, right? This all I've already explained. So this is this part, and then credentials we are decoding this, right? So we have decoded this now, and then username is having Salesforce user, password is mysecret123, which matches, right? Which matches with what JavaScript is expecting, right? So just going back to this part again, auth header is already present in the header, right, which is being sent from Salesforce. So this is not getting executed because auth header is not null. So this part will not get executed. So it will not send this response, right, this time. What would happen? The code will go to all this part, all this username and password it will fetch, and then it will compare. And in this case, we have set the correct username and password. So what it will do? It will go to this part next, and next means it will then come back to this point again, right? And then it will send you are authenticated, welcome to the secure endpoint, and that's what we got here, right? You are authenticated, welcome to the secure endpoint, right? So yeah, that's how it will work. It's pretty straightforward, right? Between Salesforce to Node.js. Now you have understood what is basic authentication. using the example of Microsoft Edge and Node.js, it's very easy to understand what's happening between Salesforce and Node.js, right? So this is how you configure basic authentication using name credentials in Salesforce and make a call out to an end system which is expecting basic authentication.
Now, next point is, what is the configuration in Salesforce because of which Salesforce is generating this authorization header? What is that configuration because of which Salesforce is generating this authorization header? So let's go back and check that. So if you remember, if I go back to the name credential, this is external credential, right? This is the name credential, basic auth NC. In this, while creating the name credentials, I left this option as checked, generate authorization header. What does it say? Generate an authorization header and apply it to each callout that references the name credentials. So this is the setting which causes or which generates the authorization header. What if I uncheck this? If I uncheck this and save, and then again make the call out. Let's close this. Yes, let's again make the call out. Authentication required, right? This time we did not get the success message. And if I go back to my Node.js console, scroll down, see this time there is no authorization header. In the last call, there was authorization header. This, as soon as I unchecked that option from the name credential, authorization header was not generated in the HTTP request. So that is the setting. That is the setting which is must if you want to implement basic authentication, which is nothing but this one, generate authorization header. So let's check this again. Right. Let's also see why we got this response. When generate authorization header was not set, why we got this 401 authentication required and then this. So what actually we are logging? Let me open this again. So first we are logging the status code here, right? And then the body, get body. And then we are logging get header keys. So status code here is what? 401 and body is authentication required, right? So if I go back to my JavaScript code, so what would have happened? Since authorization header was not present, this auth header would have been null or undefined. So that means this condition would be set to true, this whole if condition, and the control will come here. And if you see, we have already seen in that when the control comes here, in the header we have set this www authenticate, right, as a key. And in the response code we are setting 401 and this is the response which we are sending. So if I go back now, it's the same thing, right? 401 and authentication required is the response. And this second one is header keys, list of header keys. So I have not printed key value pair, just the list of header keys. So if you see, one of the keys www authenticate, right? So that means in this case, the response is coming from this code, which is expected, which is correct because auth header was not sent in the request from Salesforce, right? And if you remember, when we were testing with Microsoft Edge browser, and when browser received this response in the header, the browser prompted for username and password window. But nothing like that will happen here, right? Why? Because there is no browser. First of all, there is no browser involved here. And it's just the language of browser or the understanding of browser that when they get the response in the header, when they get this response in the header, they show a pop-up, all the browsers. But here it's not browser. It's between Salesforce and Node.js. There is no browser involved here. So there's no question of any sort of pop-up coming, right? If that is coming, if that question is coming in your mind. So there's no such concept of, pop-up for username and password because this is a system to system integration, right? Now let's also test invalid credential scenario. Okay, so where did we save the credential? We save the credential in the principal of external credential here, right? So if I click on edit and write something else here, maybe Aniket123, save it, rerun our code. Correct, right? Invalid credentials. So this part of the response is coming from this else condition 401 and invalid credentials, right? We can also check that in our Node.js console. So here we are saying wrong password. Aniket123 is not the correct password. So this is the invalid credential scenario, and we have got 401 invalid credential. Now, I did not explain this whole code line by line because this is pretty standard stuff, to make call out to an external system from Salesforce. So what you do is you create an instance of this class first, and then this class HTTP request to store the request parameters. You set the endpoint, you set the method, and then if you're using name credentials, then this is the syntax wherein you have to write call out colon, then the name of the name credential, and then slash what's after the base URL. That part you have to write here, and then to receive the response, you have to create an instance of this class, and then using this statement, you can send the request. And using these statements, you can get the status code and body and header keys from the response. So this is pretty straightforward stuff. I don't think this requires any more explanation. Now I also wanted to show Apex only implementation for this, as in without using name credentials or external credentials, how we can make this call out. And the reason I wanted to do that was that I wanted to show the difference or the comparison between when you make this call out using name credentials and when you make this call out using Apex only implementation, and what is the advantage of using name credentials, right? So I have got the code ready for the Apex only part. So this will be the Apex only implementation. Let me just, yeah. So again, pretty standard stuff. What we are doing is here, there is no name credentials involved here. So we have to do all the base64 encoding and preparing the authorization header in the Apex only, right? So again, instance of this class, then instance of this class, request, and then we'll save the username and password here, right? And then concatenate it using colon, and then base64 encoded, right? This is the endpoint for my ngrok tool, right? This is for the ngrok tool, and this is the secured endpoint, the route using which the control will land in the JavaScript code. This is the method, and then this is the header. So as I said, right, since we are not using name credential, external credentials, all this logic we have to write in our Apex code only. So if you see the header, we are setting authorization, then basic, and then we are giving a space here, and then this variable, right? And this variable will hold this base64 encoded username and password, and username and password will be colon separated. So if we had used name credentials, all these things would have been taken care by name credentials itself, right? Generating this authorization header and then concatenating this. So these all are abstracted when we use name credentials, right? And then we send the request, and we are logging again the same thing. All right, let's execute this code. Yeah, we got an error. It is expected, because if you're not using name credentials and you are using Apex only implementation, then you have to add the endpoint in the remote site settings, which is expected. So let's copy this, go to my, yeah, I'm already in the remote site settings. So if you want to, you have to go to setup and then search for remote site settings, click on new remote site setting, right? Give any name, basic auth and point, paste the URL, just the base URL, click save. It's created. Let's go back to our anonymous window, click on execute again. Yeah, we have got the same response. You are authenticated. Welcome to the secure endpoint. If I go back to my Node.js console, we have got this response. We have got this request from Salesforce, and authorization header is also generated, right? So this is working. This is Apex only implementation. Now let's see what are the disadvantages of Apex only implementation, or rather what are the advantages of name credentials, right? So if I go back to my code, the first issue here is we have to save this password in Apex, which is not the correct way of saving credentials, right? We cannot just hardcode the password in Apex. It is not a secure way of saving the credentials. So if you are using Apex only implementation, what we have to do is maybe create some custom editor record or some configuration where we have to save this password, and then we have to encrypt it as well. Even if we save it in custom data or any similar configuration, then there also it will lie exposed in the system, which is not a secure way of saving the credentials. So there also we'll have to build some sort of encryption, right? Which is an overhead. So how does name credentials takes care of this? So if I go back to my name credential, let me search for my name credential. Where did we store the credential? We stored it in our external credential, right? If I go to my external credential, and then to the principal. This is where we save the password, right? Username is fine. Username is, we can write like this, right? But password, if you see, this was the place where I saved the password, and it is masked here. It is not visible. So even if anyone navigates to this view, they will not be able to see what's the password here, right? So this is a way wherein when you use name credentials or external credentials, the password is stored in a secure manner. It is masked, right? So that is the first advantage of using name credential. Second advantage is you don't need to worry about all this encoding and all. Your name credentials will take care of it internally. It will concatenate the username and password, and it will base64 encode it, and also it will add a header with the key as authorization, and also this part, right? Basic space and this base64 encoded username and password. So all these things will be taken care of internally by name credentials and external credentials. We don't need to worry about that as well. So that is again one advantage when you use name credentials or external credentials, right? What is the third advantage? In Apex only implementation, you are hard coding the URL here, which is not a best practice, right? So in case if the URL changes tomorrow, then we have to come back to the Apex code and change the URL here as well. So every time the URL changes, we have to make changes to the Apex code, which is not a recommended way of doing it. This should be saved in some sort of configuration, and name credential then takes care of this as well. So where did we store the URL? We stored it in the name credentials, right? So this is external credential. If I go to the name credential, this is where we stored the URL. So if the URL changes tomorrow, all we have to do is just edit this name credential and change the URL. So this is also another advantage of using name credentials over Apex only implementation. All right. Now, if you remember, when I was creating principals under the external credential here, right, I configured the identity type as named principal. So there's one more option here, which is per user principal. So I did not include that configuration in this video. I will be coming up with another video where I'll explain how this per user principal work. And when that video is published, I'll leave a link of that video in the description of this video. All right.
Now, before wrapping up this video, I will cover a couple of more points. First of which is, if you remember, I talked about this authorization header, generate authorization header, and what happened when I untick this. So let me untick it once again, and I'll show you what I want to discuss. Let me untick this. Saved. Go to my dev console. Yeah, I'll execute this again. So I'll execute the code wherein we are using name credentials, right? Execute this. Debug. So we got 401 as status code, and the response is authentication required, which is expected, which we already saw earlier. Why this is happening? Because the response was being sent from this part of the JavaScript code, because we have skipped the auth header. Since we unchecked the option from the name credentials, authorization header is not generated in the request header. So we are getting this response, and 401 is being sent from here, and authentication required response is being set from here, which we can see 401 and then authentication required, right? Now let's observe what happens when we do this using Microsoft Edge browser. So for that, let me go back to my Edge browser, open incognito mode, and let me paste the URL, right? So I'll open the inspect window as well, and network tab. All right, so this all we have already seen. So as soon as I click visit site, the first action from browser will be executed. That is, it will call this endpoint. And since the browser will not send the authorization header in the first action, JavaScript code will return response from this part of the code, right? Because authorization header will not be present in the first action from the browser. And it's similar to what we have done in the using name credentials. In name credentials also, we unchecked the option of generating authorization header. So authorization header was not sent, and we got this response, right? So let's see what happens when we click visit site here. Right, so the pop-up has come. If I go to this, and if I look here, we have got the status code as 401. So this is being returned from here, 401. And this also we got in Salesforce, right? 401, right? So from Edge also, in the first action, authorization header is not being sent, and this we have already seen. If I go back to my Node.js console also, here also if you see, auth header is undefined and nowhere there is authorization header in the request header. So this is the log when I hit the API using Microsoft Edge browser. Okay. Now what I want to discuss here is, yes, we got 401 code which was returned from this part, but what about this response body, right? Authentication required. When I call this API without generating the authorization header from name, credentials, or Salesforce, we got this in the response body, authentication required, right? But when I did the same from Microsoft Edge, we are not getting that in the response body. So if I scroll down, this is response header, right? Here anyways will not get in the header, right? It's not there. Then there is request header. Response body comes here. So here you see it's not showing this response authentication required. Rather than that, it's showing something else, like, failed to load response data. So why it's happening? Why when we are not sending authorization header from browser, why the browser is not showing the response body, whereas in Salesforce it was shown? What is happening here? So what is happening here is, this is how the browsers behave, because in this scenario we sent this header as well, right, to the browser. So what happens is, as soon as browser receives this in the header response, if I go to the response headers, right, this, so in the response header it received this key value pair www authenticate basic realm, this, right? So as soon as browser receives this in the response header, it doesn't show the actual response body, which is this in this case, authentication required. It will not show the actual response body, right, in the response tab of inspect. It will not show that if I go to the response tab, because since we responded with this key value pair, right, this key value pair in the header, now the browser is expecting the user to enter the credentials, right, via the pop-up. So that's how the browsers work. If they receive this in the response header, this key value pair, they will not show the response body in the networks tab. Rather than that, they will invoke internally their own flow to show this pop-up and then wait for the user to enter the credentials. That's how the browsers work. That is the difference, when you execute the same flow from browser or when you execute the same flow from Salesforce, right? In the Salesforce, we could see the response body, which is authentication required, but in browser you will not see. Browser will suppress this and suppress that response body, and rather than that, trigger its own flow to show the pop-up. All right. However, if I go in browser and click cancel here, it is then when you click cancel, right, then it shows this authentication required. So this is the message which you get, authentication required. So that's how browsers work. Okay, that's how they work. So when you canceled it, right, if I go to the second entry, now you will get it, authentication required. Okay, so there's nothing to think too much about it. That's how the browser's behavior is. I just wanted to highlight this point. Okay, and I wanted to show one more thing. For that, let me close this once again. Let me close this. Okay, let me open incognito again, paste the URL, enter. Let me open inspect. Let me click visit site. Okay, expected. Now go to the headers. If you see here, we are getting the response 401, but we are also saying this unauthorized. From where this unauthorized is coming? We are not sending this unauthorized anywhere in the code, right? We are not sending this. We are sending authentication required with browser suppresses, but we are not sending this unauthorized. Still in the header, right? Not in the header, in the status code, it is saying unauthorized. So what happens is browser internally maintain a mapping of status code and what it means. So what Edge is doing internally here is, so for Edge, 40 means unauthorized. So they have their own mapping, predefined mappings, all the browsers. So that is the reason when we send 401 from JavaScript response for this scenario, the first action, then using its own mapping, it is saying that this is the message which has to be shown, which is unauthorized. All right. Now what will happen if I enter invalid credentials? Let's see that as well. Let me minimize this. Let me enter anything. Aniket 123. So this is invalid credential, right? This is not a credential which JavaScript is expecting. JavaScript is expecting this, right? Salesforce user my secret 123. So in this case, where it will go? It will again go in this part of the code, right? Because the username and password will not match, right? So it will go in the else part. again same thing will happen. We are setting this again the same key value pair in the header, right? So it will get the 401 response, and then it will not show this invalid credentials in the Edge, Microsoft Edge response, right? So let's see this in the Edge browser. I'll come back here. I have entered something, Aniket123, and then I'll click sign in. Okay, so we have got this entry. If I go here in the header, I've got status code I have got as 401. All right. If I go back to response, nothing, right? Nothing will come here. Invalid credentials will not be shown in the response body. So this is the same behavior because we are sending this key value pair in the response header to the browser. So browser is not showing the actual response body. Rather than that, it is again showing this pop-up to enter the credentials. So this is how the browsers work. And we have already seen in the name credentials, when we implemented name credentials and we went through the scenario of invalid credentials, we saw that, right, that in the response body, in the debug logs of the response, this was being shown, this was being returned and was being shown by the Salesforce logs, right? So from name credentials, we have seen that if you enter invalid username and password, you will get the status as 401, plus you will also get this response, right, invalid credentials. So we already saw this in the debug logs when we executed this scenario of invalid credentials. All right. Now the last part which I wanted to discuss is what is this realm? What is the significance of this? We did not discuss about this, right? So this realm is sent in the header as part of the, right? So this realm is a label which is sent by the server in the header, and it identifies a particular secure area in the server. What it means is, so this is pretty straightforward API, right? It's just a simple JavaScript code, and we have to use this credential, username and password, and then we can access this JavaScript code. And this is the realm for this JavaScript code. But there could be scenarios where there are multiple secured area on a server, right? And they could have different username and password, right? That if the client want to access those different secured areas on server, they need to enter different username and password. So what would happen in that case is each secure area will have its own realm. Okay. So based on which secure area of the server client is trying to access, the server will send this realm in the response. And based on this realm, the client will understand which credentials to use. All right. So using this realm, client can access different secure areas of the server with different credentials. So that is on a high level. What is the use of this realm? All right. So with this video is complete now. Name credentials, basic authentication. We have covered a lot of concepts, starting from what actually is basic authentication with regards to integration in general, and then we applied that to name credentials as well, and then we have seen a lot of scenarios. So I hope you will find this video useful. All right. So with this, I'll end the video. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Bye.